I'm Jane McDowell. I actually wanted to continue on with the issue because you guys raised a couple different scenarios where AES has some level of obligation to clean up the property by certain dates. But then, Zane, you also brought up if the city takes that over through eminent domain, then my question is, in that scenario, is the city then obligated to pay the cost of demolition and cleanup then, and is that going to be an obstruction? The city's not going to like doing that, right?
Right. So that's a hypothetical scenario, right, that we've tossed out. If you're going to purchase a property that's contaminated, then what's the value of the property? Actually, there might be a cost to take over that property, and so maybe the cost of condemning is actually, hey, we're going to charge you a fine, and you're going to have to pay the city to be able to take it over and actually clean it up. So it would be incorporated if they did not clean it up, which they do. I think they recognize their obligation to clean up the property in the event of any disposition of it. Then they would ultimately be liable for the cleanup still.
Can you expand on that a little bit? The obligation of AES versus the obligation of the city and where that plays out.
Well, whenever you undertake any sort of industry or manufacturing, so for example, if you have a gas station, I'm not exactly sure what the case is with a manufacturing plant. When you have a gas station, you pay into what's called the state super fund. And that's a fund specifically designated for the cleanup of the tanks and the removal of all contaminants that may have leaked into the ground at a gas station site once it is changed to some other use there. So I'm sure, especially in the most progressive state, in one of the most progressive states in the union, that we have environmental protections for the purpose of rehabilitating sites that have been contaminated through power generation. I'm not aware of what those are specifically.
I just wanted to re-emphasize again that it is a very hypothetical question, because under the initiative, to put it in the simplest terms, the initiative rezones this property. It does not condemn, nor could it legally proceed by eminent domain, nor does it even ask the city to institute eminent domain proceedings. In other words, AES continues to be the owner of this property after December 31, 2020, under this initiative. It has no effect at all on AES ownership of this property. If AES wants to sell before, it is free to do that. If AES wants to sell thereafter, it is free to do that. If the city and AES before 2020 or after 2020 engage into discussions whether to buy this property or not, that's completely outside this initiative. They're free to do that. The city is free to purchase it, or the city can decide never to purchase this property, or a state agency. If AES wants to offer portions of it to a state agency for a part, it can do so, but this initiative does not at all require AES to do that at all. So what is relevant for purposes of this initiative is, does AEF has a vested right to continue to generate power after 2020? And as lawyers, we're saying very comfortably, no, it does not have such a vested right for many reasons, one of them being that it already only now has a conditional use permit, and I want to leave you with one case that has been cited quite often since. It's called Mobile Oil Corporation versus Superior Court. It has very clear and easy language for everyone to understand, where oil companies claimed a vested right to continue to use equipment which had been permitted which they had been permitted to use for many years. And the court said this: here it appears the oil companies are asking us to determine that they have a vested right to release gasoline vapors, this was written in 1976, while dispensing fuel to their customers. How are we to answer the public, on the other hand, who assert a fundamental vested right to breathe clean air? If either exists, it must be the latter. And it's very much the same here. Maybe the pollutants are different, but in this case we're talking about pollutants that you know very well, which ones are being spewed in the air and which ones would increase with the repowering, by the way, it being first and foremost, of course, the fugitive dust pollution.
Well, particulates one.
The particulate pollution.
Yeah. Any
Yeah, I think, I don't know if the implied with the question was relating to environmental cleanup in addition to taking the buildings down or what have you. Based on my limited experience with eminent domain, I think if the city, and again this is total hypothetical, but if the city decides to pursue the eminent domain, they have the ability to reduce the value of the property based on any costs that they incur that are reasonable, that an owner would have incurred. So assuming that this property now includes a bunch of buildings and towers or what have you that are entirely useless, and somebody was going to use it to put in 3,000 condominiums, and they would have to basically spend the money to remove this stuff, well, the eminent domain value of this property would be reduced by the amount that it would cost to remove the stuff that any other owner would have done. So that's the process of the eminent domain. But for the environmental part, that was part of your question, AES or any other property owner or any other responsible party that caused the contamination, even if they're not property owners, are clearly continuingly responsible going forward until the property is cleaned up, until they get what's called a no further action letter or a closure letter from the government agency. So if this property is overseen by the Regional Water Quality Control Board or by the Department of Toxic Substances Control, the board or the Department of Toxic Substances doesn't care who owns the property. It's who caused the problem. They're basically the responsible party going forward until we do a cleanup. And as Frank mentioned, there's nothing in the ordinance that changes ownership anyway. But even if the ordinance leads to a change of ownership because now they're not going to use it as a power plant anymore and they're going to sell it, their obligation to continue to do the cleanup of the property is not going to change as far as the government agency is concerned. They're going to continue to be financially liable to the cleanup. They can enter into an agreement if they want to with the next owner to continue the cleanup, but from a financial standpoint and from a government agency obligation standpoint, the water board is not going to let them off the hook until the cleanup is complete and until they get, again, what's called the no further action letter from the agency that basically says we're not requiring to do any further action. And even if they get a no further action letter, actually a lot of these letters will include the lawyer disclaimer language that says at this time, which basically means if the agency later on finds a problem, let's say that AES doesn't assess all the property, the 50 acres, and they only assess 25 acres and they list the other 25, says, hey, we don't have any problems here, we're going to leave it alone. If 10 years from now, an ex-property owner finds contamination that was caused by AES, a government agency can go back to AES and say, hey, you didn't tell us about this, you didn't investigate it, we found this problem, come back and clean it up. And I've been involved in environmental cleanups that were actually caused in the 50s and 60s for companies that were bought by another company in the 50s and 60s. And the contamination is discovered in the 80s and 90s, and the agency comes in and says, hey, you bought this company caused this problem, come and clean it up. And there's no defense to it.
Yeah, I just want to, I'm glad you brought that up, Hanny. When I was in the federal government working for the Air Force, I was up at Vandenberg Air Force Base up north of here about 3 hours, and I had to sign off on a lot of these rocket fuels that are very, very, not just hazardous, but very toxic, nitrogen tetroxide, monomethylhydrazine stuff, I still don't know what it is. But one of the things that I was taught was, number one, you can never relinquish your responsibility. Even me as the personal signer on that, I could never relinquish my responsibility once I was in charge of those pollutants. And second, if a company does abandon a property and doesn't clean it up, there's provision. There's provision in the law that the feds or the state, I think, can come in and clean it up and then charge them for that cleanup. So if they don't want to play ball, you can go after them. And with AES Southland, AES Redondo may claim bankruptcy, but then you have AES Southland, and then you've got the big AES corporate, and then all the way back to SCE, who's one of the original polluters of the property.
And just so everybody knows, AES Corporation is an $18 billion corporation with 132 power plants around the world, so they would have the financial resources if they were fined. You have a question here?